Okay. Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the fourth season of Sheltering Places. Um, this program began as the New Center's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and over the course of 3 seasons, it has served as a way for our students, researchers, and instructors to engage with one another and with renowned artists, curators, philosophers across a range of urgent topics. It is a successful student-run attempt to experiment with modes of informal intellectual exchange, as the opportunities for face-to-face interactions have been eroded globally. As an online institution at the forefront of innovating knowledge production and transmission since 2014, the New Center hopes that Sheltering Places can continue to support collaborative thinking and contribute to public discourse in the next few years. In this conversation, we will attempt to draw the outlines of the conceptualization of noise as a family resemblance. On the one hand, noise is a valuable concept in the realm of scientific enterprises such as statistics, cybernetics, and information theory. On the other hand, it is a fundamental notion for artistic practices and the philosophy of aesthetics. How can we construct a synoptic view of noise that assembles all of its possible perspectives in a constructive sense, in which one way informs the other? What could be the importance of engaging with noise in the pursuit of social equality and emancipation? How could it be possible to overcome the anxiety produced by uncertainty and fragility at a transcendental level? Those are the questions we are posing.
I would like to thank you all for accepting the invitation to be here today. It's a great happiness for me. Well, I read your bios. Cecile Malaspina is a philosopher based in London. She's the author of An Epistemology of Noise and principal translator of Gilbert Simondon's on the mode of existence of technical objects. In 2019, she was nominated to a 6-year chair as Directeur de Programme à l'étranger at the Collège International de Philosophie, Paris. Her program is hosted by King's College London, where she is a visiting research fellow. She was elected to the CIPH's executive board and is a member of the editorial board of the CIPH's Rue Descartes and its book series at the Presse de Paris Nanterre. She is contributing editor for Angelaki, commissioning editor at Copy Press, and guest editor at Nature, Humanities and Social Science Communications. J P Caron is a philosopher and artist based on Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. His doctoral research developed at both the University of Paris and the University of São Paulo, proposed a critique of the aesthetic philosophy of John Cage in the context of contemporary ontology of art and philosophy of language. He's a lecturer in philosophy in the UFRJ, UFRJ, and he militates in the Circle of Studies of the Idea and Ideology. He's also been practicing noise and experimental music for more than 15 years, and several of his records have been released, many through his own imprint, Seminal Records. Recently, he's been working on the problem of generic organization as it appears in different fields like art, science, and politics, and its relationship to scale sensitivity. Mattin has exhibited and toured worldwide, performed in festivals such as Performa, No Fun, Club Transmedial, and Arica, and has over 100 releases in different labels worldwide. In 2017, he completed a PhD at the University of the Basque Country under the supervision of the philosopher Ray Brassier. Along with Anthony Iles, he edited the book Noise and Capitalism. In 2012, CAC Bretigny and Tuamatuja published Unconstituted Praxis, a book collecting his writing plus interviews and reviews from performances. Both books are available online. Anthony Iles and Mattin are currently in the final stages of editing the volume, What is to be Done Under Real Subsumption. And Urbanomic will publish this year the book Social Dissonance by Mattin. Mattin is also part of the bands Billy Ball and Regular, and currently he's co-hosting with Miguel Prado the podcast Social Discipline. We invited you all here to join a conversation about how artistic practice is involving noise, but not just artistic practice, can be informed by this transdisciplinary account of noise as an anomaly. And in the words of Malaspina, the index of a renewed and more confident scientific, artistic, and philosophical culture of qualified uncertainty. What are the concrete implications of this multifaceted conception of noise in social and political organization and at the level of the transcendental structure of experience? In order to explore these subjects, our aim is to put the following perspectives in a dialogue. Malaspina in her work, Epistemology of Noise, regarding the intertwined scientific, technological, moral, and political conception of noise. Mattin and his notion of noise as a device for the production of estrangements and fragility, and also the idea that there is an urgency to the decommodification and de-aestheticization of noise, and that it possesses an emancipatory and revolutionary character. And J P Caron, with his ideas about generative aesthetics as a fundamentally normative endeavor and a way of word making and word unmaking, of tinkering the parameters of experience itself. So I would like to begin with a general question, but that I believe that encompasses all of the approach present here, along with this that you make comments to, that was already in the description of the event. I would like to say that, well, we're living in a time where the attention span of the general population is decreasing, while a certain predisposition to anxiety and the emergence of catastrophic attitude and behavior is increasing at different levels and scales. And this, I believe, can be taken as a symptom of the commodification of experience, an extension of the liberal emphasis in the individual as a fundamental given. It appears to me that every one of you is tackling this question somehow, whether through positing the individual, agent, or signal as the result and some kinds of halting point of an otherwise continuous process of individuation via Simondon, as Cecile writes, or through appealing to the concept of a phenomenal self-model that schematizes oneself as perhaps an apperceptive and discursive unity of experience, revealing selfhood as a malleable fiction or disposable illusion, I don't know, or through changing the aim of our social practices without announcing, generating some kind of normative rewiring that makes us question the necessity of certain procedures, such as those which the existence of individual as an axiomatic truth or grammatical proposition. How do each of you conceive the role of noise in this revenge against the individual? And do you recognize any discordances in regard to one another's approach? And what do we do with all these hygienist and perverse forms of capitalist mediation? As an example, social media, after we acknowledge the transparency of its mechanisms. If you guys can comment a little.
Maybe we should start with Cecile.
You're muted, Cecile.
I think you're muted. Sorry.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm not quick enough to just jump on the question of individuation, and noise obviously is a big one. You can approach it from various angles. The relationship with the commodification of the self and social networks is interesting, because I think actually there are two different things happening at the same time. On the one hand, you have a tendency in social media to produce very, very stereotypical, extremely stereotypical forms of individuation. So you have individuals who are reduced to a kind of semantic poverty of symbols that can be recognized, that is perhaps the worst of a kind of commodification of self. But on the other hand, I also think that in the access to a kind of plasticity of staging the self, even though it might in the first instance for many people be something very reductive to how you want to appear, to the kind of symbol or cipher that you want to be, that characterize, the number of your followers and a few other semantic. No, you're gone. No, you're still there. Sorry. But at the same time, I think that what is going on is that taking possession of this process of mediation also allows people a certain plasticity to, you feel the social norm, but at the same time you have it in your own hands to a certain extent to be able to do something completely new with it. And the kind of perversity of this process also has strange flowers. It produces strange flowers in a way that I think that would be my spontaneous response, to say that even if you wanted to, you couldn't suppress the noise, and that the noise that is in this process of individuation it's better to say individualization of people who like to see themselves represented in social media, that this noise in itself opens avenues for a certain plasticity and normativity in how you conceive of the self.
Yeah, I would add to that, like a certain distinction that we have to make between like a phenomenal self and the proper subject, in a sense. I think mainly the issue with social media and these kind of things is the confusion that it proposes between these two. Like you are almost adhering to a certain image of yourself that is a kind of a phenomenal self that you desire to be cast as, you see. So but at the same time, the pure negation of this phenomenality is not really for me an interesting path. I mean, as I'm sure many of you know, my previous work was on John Cage, who was trying to exactly put out of circulation this, so to speak, phenomenal self, because the practice of indeterminacy that he was proposing was a kind of bypassing of his own, as Mattin would have it, maybe the authority of his own taste, in a sense. So as a composer, I won't be determining the material in the way that I would want to, in the way that I would like to. I would open the structure of the work to whatever happens. But this for me is ideological in itself. This is the main issue with Cage. There is a critique to the phenomenal self there, but at the same time it reifies experience, which is another kind of commodification in a sense. And what's most interesting to me is that within that same operation, if you try to go beyond the veil of the ideological veil, you can see that there is a kind of logic to the situation that amounts to the workings of a certain logical subject, because by trying to bypass the authority of taste, he thinks he's exhibiting an image of natural immanence, nature in its manner of operation, like he used to say. But what he's actually showing is the normative infrastructure of the concert music world in itself, in a sense. So, and this is showing the infrastructure for the takings as and the conceptualizing of things as artworks or music or whatever way you want to conceptualize. And of course, it is in a regional manner, because he's an artist and he's working in the art system, so to speak. So in order to do that in a more ample scale, I'm not. That's a big problem, because then I have the critique of my own critique, because in a sense art is a system closed under a certain set of operations. So it's quite difficult to go out of art by doing art still, like as was the project of the avant-garde of the classical historic avant-garde in a certain sense. So yeah, that would be my first, I don't know, ramble. And I don't know, maybe Mattin wants to jump in and
I think this is a great a great point, or a good moment for me, in the sense that I take John Cage as my starting point, or as an object of critique, in the sense of, I take the moment, like the book, The Social Dissonance, almost opens up with the anechoic chamber experience of John Cage, where he went famously to this anechoic chamber, experiencing silence, and then he heard two sounds, and he asked the technician, and the technician asked him to describe them, and he said there was a high tone and a low tone. The high tone, the technician said, was the nervous system. The low tone was the blood system. And for me, I call this the ideological chamber experience, because as JP rightly pointed out, this whole conception is already ideological. I mean, and here we can see a conflation between his phenomenological approach to sound, in the sense of kind of trying to think the sound in themselves, as if they were outside of the context or the kind of points of cognition, and his anarchist politics, which, he was able to develop this narrative and to generate this idea of, what he would, how he will conceive music. And by doing that, he actually changed the course of music. But like, for example, there is a moment in which Douglas Kahn points out that there was a third sound, and it was the sound of him realizing about the two previous sounds. And then what I do is like take, okay, this realization, this, that it already kind of, this experience, it already is conceptually mediated, which means is socially mediated. So this is the kind of first step to kind of undermine that kind of purely phenomenological approach. And for me, this is crucial, because what I try to do is that, even though, as JP was already saying, that he was trying to undermine the individual through, the taste and through chance, but he was also kind of reinforcing it by, giving it like this potential to generate a kind of a specific narrative, taking the individual as experience as a starting point. So what I try to do is to undermine, because the way that I conceive, the way that I'm working with noise is quite specifically, and I take it from Cecile Malaspina in her section, The Mental State of Noise. So it's a kind of psychological noise that I'm interested in exploring. And for me, this noise is, a social dissonance that occurs when you collapse the notion of the individual and the selfhood with the subject. And that's, what liberalism has been doing, from the very, from John Locke and onwards, is to kind of think that you as an individual, with your ability, with rational ability, have the possibility to make decisions and to have agency and to have the capacity of self-reflection. But this is a form of reification, it's a form of, what you have is a form of reifying the individual and to cut its connections, its social kind of connections, which, as we know in capitalist relations, this kind of form of sociability is opaque. Is not, we're not able to see it. And here we see a kind of parallel to the way that Metzinger is kind of undermining the transparency of selfhood, or kind of exploring the way that is kind of constructed through neuroprocessual mechanisms, and the way in which at the, both conceptual and practical level in everyday life, it is constructed through our social practices, but as the notion of selfhood reifies into a supposed to sovereign subject. And what I'm trying to do, what I think this social dissonance or noise, I think can be utilized in the aesthetic realm, is to show that discrepancy that exists, between the projection of the individual as a subject that we have in this society, that is, we need to constantly, is constantly being reproduced and projected, and then the impossibility to actually achieve it. And for me, this is the kind of crucial where, I am interested in exploring, the potential of noise. I see there a kind of big potential in noise insofar as it shows that kind of discrepancies, and we can use it. This, what noise allows us is to explore it, both at the conceptual realm, at the experiential realm, and it it shows a kind of negativity that I think is it can be very powerfully explored. And I think, I don't know, what you were saying, like you were asking, to what extent relate our projects, as Cecile was saying, I think they complement very much, each of the projects, at least, I take from Cecile, a lot of, a lot, great. And then conversations with JP has also extremely influential for me. Also Miguel Prados, Inigo Wilkins, there is like several people that we are working around these themes, but taking them into specific directions. And I think, I'm very excited about how they complement, and it's like a work in progress, but the concept of noise allow us for, a kind of exploration, a never-ending form of exploration.
With that, I wanted to go back to Cecile, because since she had no time to think about the question, and she's right about that, maybe let's try to have her conclude, and also make addendums to JP's and Mattin's points. And I think Mattin's made a couple of good points there that Cecile could pick up on, and JP too. But I was interested in Cecile's answer because she was very optimistic about technology, I think, apparently. And Simondon was never like a technophobe, right? He tried to understand technology like in itself without glorifying it or demonizing it. And as JP, as JP said, the phenomenality of the self in social media is constrained, right, by design and the structure of the social media itself and the possible signs to be made there. But it is more or less as constrained as our bodily phenomenality, right? As like Mattin says, there is no like immediate experience of the individual or individuation, right? So, and I also have another question for Cecile, for all of you, but maybe tending to Cecile more, because like Simondon distinguishes between noise and information, exactly because information has this uniform code that orients it, right? And you pick on that a bit. But what do you think of the relationship between noise and Simondon's pre-individual ground? Like, it seems like, and I'm following here a Brazilian Simondonian called Vinicius Portela, who I think it seems like this category of noise fits the ground pretty well. Like it's a non-formal dynamism that works as a reservoir for all possible forms, and that includes all tendential virtuality of forms. Like I feel like noise is exactly the kind of vital matter that works behind figures and behind information. And these figures are brought to actuality by a couple of techniques and like extracted and delineated from noise as a sort of rational contour of noise, right? So what do you think of the relationship between information and noise as an iteration of Simondon's figure ground relation? And if you want to conclude an answer to JP and Mattin, go ahead.
Yes, I get the first word and the conclusion. Putting me on the spot here slightly. And you're also asking me the most difficult question about Simondon, which is one of the reasons why I cannot approach noise with a Simondonian perspective, but I haven't completely resolved this. But I want to come back to what JP said earlier and connected with a conversation I had with Mattin a couple of days ago. When you talk about cage, what came back to my mind was the criticism that Gaston Bachelard makes of Descartes, of the tabula rasa, and he says there's no such thing as a tabula rasa on the basis of 500 years of debate that have been going on and raging, on the basis of which you are declaring the tabula rasa. So I think the tabula rasa is a device, but it doesn't actually do what it claims to do. It does something for sure, because it allows you to mix the stack of cards differently to a certain extent, but it doesn't get rid of the presuppositions to a certain extent that have brought you to the point at which you can make this claim. And one of the discussions that have happened in the centuries leading up to Descartes declaring this tabula rasa on the basis of which he can say, I think, therefore I am, is the discussion that Thomas of Aquinas had, if you like, across time with philosophers who came before him, which were people defending the Averroist interpretation of Aristotle regarding the intellect. The reason I mention this is that you had a very powerful strand in philosophy arguing for the intellect being something that is not reducible to the individual, to the personhood, to selfhood. So that is something that is certain aspects in the chain of intellection are anchored in an individual or in several individuals, but there was definitely scope to think of the intellect as something that is not reduced in the same way that now, for example, we think of the subject as something that is not reducible to the self, certainly not to the self that is staged and produced in the theatrical sense of the term in social media. So this is one thing that I wanted to say. This idea of the tabula rasa as a device that is not nothing, that has its efficacy, but it doesn't exactly do what it says it does. It cannot wipe clear all our presuppositions. We don't start with a complete epoche, kind of suspension of all our preconceptions. And when I had this conversation with Mattin last week about social dissonance, there was something that struck me, which was this idea of phantom objectivity. That is a term that Lukács, I think, was it Lukács? Yeah, uses to talk about the way that the relation between people is objectified, and it becomes this kind of phantom objectivity, when actually it's something, it's a process, it's something fluid. And you could say that what happens with Descartes similarly is a subjectivity. So that the process of thinking that posits itself as thinking posits a self that is like a phantom object in that moment. And if you transpose this to the problem of social media, it's probably much more crass, and you can see the fictionality of it in a way that is more evident. This staging of the self as something that is a phantom object, and that nevertheless becomes something relatively concrete because it exists online, it exists in the lives of other people, it has an efficacy in the choices that people make. So that was one way that I would try to kind of weave these different topics slightly together.
Yeah.
Say, Mattin?
No, it's interesting that you brought that to the card, because that comment, it really struck me, because it's something that I've been, as I said, trying to think of the self as a kind of reified kind of concept. But when you obviously brought it very clearly, to the Lukács moment of phantom objectivity, it made me think in the direct connection that there is with Thomas Metzinger, when he explored all these, rubber limbs experiments, and so it's a kind of another form of phantom objectivity, but in the kind of neuroprocessual, elements that constitute our idea of selfhood. But it's interesting that kind of phantom objectivity, it resonates with these three kind of processes, like in the Marxist, and the Marxist perspective of Lukács, with you, in the idea of the subject for Descartes, and then in the way that Thomas Metzinger thinks of selfhood as a form of, phantom, if you wish. And I think there, for me, I guess the crucial question is the interconnection. Like how does this interconnection occurs, and what, and to what extent can the concept of noise help us in these three different kind of approaches, and what will be their interconnections? That's for me the very crucial kind of question.
It's interesting that you just say that, because the next question that I actually had for you, Mattin, had quite a lot to do with it, in the sense that I write that social dissonance is at the same time a diagnostic and or a symptom, and an instrument to explore this kind of mediations. And I asked that to what extent and in what way social dissonance allows for some kind of hack into our phenomenal self-model and in our social / pragmatic infrastructure, and how to use this alienation as a tool to unlearn givenness in its most general sense. And if it does suffice, if it suffices to maintain an anti-essentialist view of an alienation, and just if you could expand in what these possible relations that we can encounter between what you call this alienation from below and then alienation from above.
Well, yeah, I guess what I'm trying to do is whether, to see in the realm of performance or concerts, is to explore that kind of gap, that social dissonance. And I think it is possible precisely because, I mean, I guess a lot of the things that it's like kind of, I guess, I don't know if hacking is the right term, but, kind of inverting, John Cage, Okay, so in concerts, there is like, just by being there, there is sounds, there will be kind of sounds. And, for me, it's like, okay, there's not only sounds, there is people, and there is people who have a very problematic kind of conception of themselves, like we all have, precisely because the relationship between selfhood and subjectivity is certainly not stable, cannot be stabilized, and is very problematic. So it's like, okay, so there's social relations that contain a lot of noise, and I'm interested in exploring that kind of noise. And then so and here, the terms become, it's difficult to be precise, but I kind of, so okay, I try to explore forms of estrangement as a way to better understand structural forms of alienation. And here these concepts become kind of not interchangeable, but like, one could go from one to the other. But like one helpful comment that Ray Brassier did in the introduction for the book is to try to produce not the estrangement of experience, but not the experience of estrangement, but the estrangement of experience. And this will kind of go into try to kind of problematize what we conceive experience to be. And I think, I guess that's what I'm, kind of trying to achieve. And that doesn't mean, I don't know if it's learning more. It's learning more. It's like kind of taking hold of the forms of estrangement that noise can produce as a way to further investigate this kind of gap or complex relationship between selfhood and subjectivity in relationship to the social relations at the structural level. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
So I think this takes me a little bit to the other question, which is to everyone, but I think tends more to JP, because noise seems to be this highly non-referential thing, right? Which is different from most other like art entities, for example, which either represent something or connotate something else by exemplification. or at least that's one of like Goodman's arguments, right? And JP can correct me if I'm wrong. But noise doesn't sample any predicates, neither like literally nor metaphorically. It's not like a label. It's not a grammar for the presentation of some set of objects. And this is one of the reasons for it being word-unmaking in our terminology here. So why is it then that noise, like musicians and aesthetic theorists, insist in like associating noise with some very clearly defined secondary qualities? Like, why does noise have such a heavy social apparatus around it? Like, why is it so difficult to disentangle noise as a concept from like information and as an aesthetic and coming mostly from black matter, right? Do you think that's relevant? Do you think that's healthy to do? And do you think, why do you think that's so hard to do?
I think it's inevitable. I don't think noise is against exemplification. I think the semantics of noise, if you come from Nelson Goodman, would be mostly an example of exemplification. Sorry for the repetition, example of exemplification. But yeah, the fact is, if you don't have a code that makes explicit the reference of a certain symbol, exemplification is a good candidate for understanding the referential routing of a certain phenomenon. So noise is actually a pretty good candidate for being used as exemplification. What is exemplification in the sense of Goodman? Is the reference to the property that the phenomenon itself has. Like if noise is, let us say, noisy, if you have like a phenomenon, like for instance, a static sound in a certain kind of sound configuration, and there's an overlap there between natural language and the Goodman's formalism that kind of make this kind of tricky, but to talk about. But the thing is, noisy is also a predicate. So if you have actually a music consisting of what acoustically we call noise, it is pretty easy to fall back into the predicate, the natural language predicate, culturally informed predicate, noisy. Oh, this is noisy, or this is violent, or this expresses angst, etc. So this is the operation in place in most noise music. So this is not because noise does not lend itself to that. No, noise does lend itself to that. The philosophical question here would be, is there a concept of noise that bypasses this referential fabric? So this is a different kind of thing. And I think this is something that Cecile's work helped to do, and Mattin's work in performance is trying to do in action, actually, to de-commodify noise, because as much as it is important and useful, and you can't have knowledge and thinking without predicate, without this, referential fabric that you can easily or fruitfully get from Goodman's thinking. There is also a different another side to that, is the fact that, well, you don't want the routings to be too stable. When the routing is too stable, is a kind of reification. Like now we are already trained to listen to noise in a certain way, so it's not really, let us say, noisy in our philosophical sense anymore. It may be noisy in the natural language genre sense. And this is something, for instance, that Ray Brassier was also gesturing at in his genre is obsolete paper, quite a while back, you see. So I think there's an overlap in your question. There's a kind of an overlap between a natural language, culturally driven understanding of noisy, and a proper, maybe more technical device of seeing noise as a perturbation of this referential route, you see. But then this gets also caught up back again in a referential route, because you can't really symbolize things without that. So it's always, there's a dialectic going on between these notions. And this is why I also take issue with the understanding of noise as a plane of immanence. So I think you were kind of gesturing towards it with your first question to Cecile. From the Simondonian perspective, well, I'm more familiar with the Deleuzian one, and it's quite, there's an overlap there as well. Like, oh, it seems that noise is understood in a kind of negative theology sense. It is not this and that. It is not conceptual. It is not rational. It is not maybe even phenomenal, which is a little bit more interesting to me. To have noise that is not phenomenal. Maybe the plane of immanence lends itself to that. And this is a more interesting component for me from the Deleuzian perspective. But nevertheless, I don't think it's the best perspective to understanding noise because of this dialectic. I don't think really you have pure noise or a pure plane of immanence, even if there are some aesthetic practices that might actually symbolically try to exemplify some properties of that. For instance, harsh wall noise is, they kind of try to present you with something that is akin to a plane of immanence, like a field of differences, and actually it's pretty static. There's no difference whatsoever in terms of a time unfolding, the temporal unfolding of the phenomenon, right? But yeah, I don't think that is the best way to look into it. I think it reifies noise in a negative sense, and I think both our works are trying to deal with it in a more gradient sense, in a certain point of view. You see, well, I think if somebody wants to jump in, then by now I don't know. Nope.
Anyone? We can just go to the next question if Cecile and Mattin have nothing to say.
I'm glad about what JP said about Simondon, because yeah, I had a quick exchange with Vicinius about this idea of ground. I think it's one possible avenue. There's several problems with Simondon if you want to do this, because I think if you want to do a philosophy of noise, you're not doing Simondon essentially. Fundamentally, at the end, I think this is the conclusion I've come to. It doesn't mean that there are not resources for thinking noise in Simondon, and I think there are plenty, but you have to be careful at the points of conversion, at the kind of transformations that you have to operate in this transposition. One of them is the fact that I think for Simondon, on several occasions, well, first of all, Simondon actually has a very sophisticated understanding of information. He understands both information entropy and negentropy, and sometimes it's not entirely clear that he knows that he's doing two different things, but he definitely has these two separate understandings. It's not clear entirely what role the two understandings of information play. What I feel, so first, the one extreme of constraint that makes it hard to think about noise in Simondonian terms is that he several times says very explicitly that pure chance is not really a factor in individuation, and it is very rarely, and if at all, it leads to very transient things that really he's not that interested in. The other thing on this end of the spectrum that makes it hard to think about noise with Simondon is that there is in this theory of individuation a kind of semantic compulsion. One thing always leads to another. You have this kind of transductive principle that creates a kind of pulses of resonance throughout the different regimes of being. And there is, so I think all this makes it kind of hard to be very serious about thinking about noise within the Simondonian paradigm. However, there is also an emergency brake that stops Simondon from a kind of totalization within which everything is transductive and fully resonant and totalized. And that is the fact that he also rejected systematic philosophy, in the sense that he says he's not interested in building a complete system. There is a kind of what do you call it, spawning. There's a way in which he's probably conceiving of this transductive dynamic as a spawning, one that can spawn also a plurality of different logics. And so in a way, I think this is the kind of escape sign from Simondon that would be too much unified, if you like, or too totalized. But I don't know if that in itself makes it so inviting to really think about noise in Simondonian terms. If you have to, I still think that there are interesting avenues to pursue, and ground is probably one of them, but you have to do it carefully so as to avoid what JP was saying, this idea of a kind of negative theology or negative Genesis project. And I think it's not so easy, but I'm still working on it a little bit, obviously, because he's always in the back of my mind.
I was thinking about that. Thank you, Cecile. In regard to your previous text, the noise paradigm, you wrote something there about a cyclical re-emergence of an epistemological crisis, and that this is a symptom of a certain rigidity. So in opposition to this model of paradigm shifts, we could have perpetual regional reinventions. Do this qualified culture of uncertainty that you mentioned in your book coincide with or requires this kind of epistemological holism that you stress in this earlier text? Maybe you, JP, has something to say about that too, because there's some kind of holism conceived by Goodman in regards to entrenched predicates. You mentioned something about that in your last text. I don't know if it was a question. I don't know. About this contraposition in science, these movements, different frameworks, perpetual regional reinventions, and this kind of rough paradigm shift. You kind of reclaims this first in regards to the last. I don't know. Maybe you can expand a little about that. I read this text and I got a little curious about.
So I don't know if the question is more for me or more for JP.
It's more for you.
Okay. It was 10 years ago I wrote it. It sounds interesting now that you mentioned it, but I can't really remember what I said in this text. I mean, I would have to literally improvise on it, because what did I say that basically rather than thinking of it in terms of a kind of wholesale paradigm shift, I was thinking about it in terms of regional reinvention, and that suits me still. I think I would still prefer to think that way. In analogy with that, we had a conversation with Mattin recently, where it occurred to me that perhaps the category of the event in history is something slightly hypostatized, kind of overblown. Perhaps the rational inventions, there is a continuous process of transformation that happens all the time in kind of in a distributed way, and occasionally they team up in a way that creates a momentum that is more noticeable, that enters the kind of collective consciousness more. But I would think probably that it comes back to the question of optimism about technology earlier. I'm not an optimist, but I'm not a pessimist either. I think both are forms of degrees of superstition, because we can't model sufficiently into the future to warrant either pessimism or optimism, and we can't even account fully for the past, because our historiography is like a sieve with gigantic holes. To a certain extent, yes, this distributed form of transformation, regional transformations that happen all the time, whether you want it or not. To a certain extent, it also means that visions of totalitarian control, that everything will be under control, they don't have much more hope of being optimistic and succeeding than anything else has, because there is a process of continuous voluntary and involuntary thwarting of what the objective is. I don't know. That's my. It's kind of. I'm glad that there's an element of fidelity to myself 10 years ago, but I can't remember myself 10 years ago.
Yeah, I can't really answer to this question because I also don't remember Cecile's text, so I'm not sure how it relates to what I was doing recently. So if Cássia wants to enlighten me, maybe I can provide an answer to that. Otherwise, I'm not sure how to proceed.
It strikes me as if there is I don't know, some positive relation between these regional reinventions in the fields of science, technology, I don't know, and what you're trying to do with the concept of constitutive dissociation, in the sense that it promotes, I don't know, piecemeal transformations in our normative practices, and it disavows the idea of a total reformation or total I don't know, passage from one paradigm to another.
I see what you mean. Yeah. Yeah, I see what you mean. Like it's the connection between a certain reconfiguration of a localized world or practice. Like the fact that it is being revised, but it is also a localized revision. So this is the connection you are making. I see. I guess. But this was already in Goodman. You see, the paper you're mentioning, the on constitutive dissociation, was the paper on Flint. I'm not sure if that was clear enough in the paper, but there is a difference, right? There is a difference between Flint and Goodman in that respect, because, well, Flint is a revolutionary. Like Flint is somebody that his first book was called Blueprint for a Higher Civilization. You see, it's like, and I don't really agree with his epistemology, which is a globally anti-realist epistemology. Even it's more radical than that, because nihilistic cognitive nihilism, as he proposes, there's actually a kind of virtue in that, because there's a discipline that goes with it, that is to uphold each and every thought as untrue, which is kind of utopian by itself, in itself, you see. So there's also the difficulty is there is also a global project of revision in Flint's work, you see. But the fact is that the technical means of achieving it that I was proposing in that paper to look into, one of which is constitutive dissociations. I brought my notes, so I have a quote for that. Flint says, "Consider a situation or configuration which is established by ordainments or stipulations of rules. The situation may belong to a genre which is standardized, a genre having a protocol which is standard or straightforwardly ascertainable. Moreover, the genre may have customary aims, although they do not have the force of requirements. A constitutive dissociation comes about because the instigator of a situation alters the aims of the genre from the customary aims. Since the traditional aims are foregone, the instigator can evade or replace standard protocol with an inscrutable protocol." So the thing is, one could see this cognitive nihilism thing as going, as converging, this constitutive dissociation technique as converging with the aims of the nihilistic cognitive nihilism that Flint wants to propose. But what I was also proposing was to reroute this technique and make it solidary with world making. So the idea of world unmaking, that was, I see you use it in your title, was taken out of these constitutive dissociated situations that Flint was proposing. That was a means of severing the ties, unbinding the situation. If you think of a certain situation, let's use a situation in a general sense, like Alain Badiou does, for instance. There are situations. A situation is characterized by a certain morphology. Let us say there are certain bindings that propose a structure for the situation, that makes explicit a structure for the situation. When you constitutively dissociate, is when you are unbinding or cutting off, severing inferential ties that hold the situation together. So this is the world-unmaking side of it. But as a Hegelian, I would say, when you world-unmake, you world-make. This was my rejoinder, because by severing the ties of a certain situation, you are paving the way for a rewiring of the diagram of certain situations. So this was a proposal. So this is actually, in a sense, agreeing with a certain technique that Flint is putting forward, while disagreeing with his whole epistemology of nihilistic cognitive nihilism, and trying to make it compatible with Goodmanian world makings. But also this has a further dimension that is interesting to me, is that you're not only world making in the cognitive epistemic sense, as like an armchair philosopher would, thinking up situations. You are intervening. If you put this in practice, you are intervening in concrete situations in the world, which means you're a member of the situation you are intervening upon. So this has a further dimension that might bring a certain form of realism to the thesis. That is, okay, I'm included in the set that I am theorizing and actually practically rewiring the situation that I'm practically rewiring. And this I was calling life forming, because you come with certain presuppositions that come from a certain form of life. Those might be unexamined, okay? This is not necessarily a rational process from the start, because those are empirical ways of going about that may be unexamined, you see? And the fact that you are applying a certain rewiring of the inferential paths to the form of life that you are a part of, in a sense, is also changing the ground from which you are thinking. So this has a plethora of different issues that comes with it. And I think this is quite similar in a sense. I mean, it's almost like a specific case with a certain specific structure to, I mean, Mattin's social dissonances protocols, in a sense.
I totally agree, and I'm really glad that you brought this up, because I was kind of trying to think the way that we try to work when doing this social dissonance or working with the audience as an instrument is to like using this concept of ungrounding, which is to try to take away the social conventions of a given situation, and then not so all the kind of expectations and projections that people have, they become material because there's nothing to project into. There's no kind of center, there's no ground, them all that kind of self, all these kind of misfire projections become the material to be used. The question, and then so then you get rid of certain presuppositions of what is supposed to happen, even though for a very limited time of being, and then things occur. But I wouldn't go, or so far, I wouldn't go as far as life forming. For me, so far, I only can envisage the potential to explore, this kind of social dissonance, precisely because there is a kind of a broader structure, process of commodification, that whatever life form that you might be able to generate, it will make actually. It will qualify, quantify it. It will make it into empty homogeneous labor time. So it's I'm scared of the propositional aspect of this life forming in the current conditions, where every kind of propositional, or many of the propositional forms, they become kind of ideological gadgets for either artists to keep going, or us to kind of talk about it, yes, if there was already some kind of emancipatory qualities occurring. And so the way that I will be careful, or at least I will pose the question, will be do you see this as having this, life forming as having emancipatory potential? And in those regards, if yes, why and how? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, as an abstraction, as a certain form of thinking about this, it has emancipatory potential. I think it's I mean, what we can do in a sense, we can think things through and come up with certain techniques that might be successful or not given certain specific situations. So this would be just a piecemeal revision, a piecemeal intervention, like an experiment. You can do like an experiment, a social experiment, or better said, an experiment with social structures, more than a social experiment, and see what comes about from this. So I'm not saying anything superlative like, oh, life form, this will shape completely, change completely the form of life. No, but maybe it's good if I make explicit the assumptions that form of life in the sense that I'm using is the Wittgensteinian sense, that is of course a kind of non-centralized, non-totalized. So in that sense, life forming is the rewiring, the reinvention of a certain region of, social structure, not of the totality. Then I'm with you. I agree with you, actually. In terms of the social totality, it's not that life forming doesn't have traction, but in order to have traction, you have to intervene upon certain infrastructural regions that are, of course, out of reach for, a philosopher, a scientist, a social scientist, an artist. They are out of reach. So you have to actually engage in mesopolitics, really, in big politics, something like that. And because of the gradient of, force between these kinds of influence. So this would be my response. It's not that I'm committed to a superlative effect of this, but it is just that I am trying to put forward certain techniques that might be, when enacted in localized situations, might be fruitful and have certain results. Just that. It's just like a protocol, a recipe for further experimenting. So I actually agree with the final assessment that you give. No one else? I see there's a bunch of actually discussions in the YouTube page, which are quite intense, actually.
Oh God, thank God I didn't see that. I would have inhibited me.
Yeah, there was a couple of questions, but it's more of a discussion than a proper question. So I think Cássia had another question. At the end of it, we can go. Maybe we can check this question out later. But I think it's just a big discussion right now between Miguel Prado and Kirill Potapov and some other people here, Henrique Wao. Yeah, just a bunch of interesting people actually. But yeah, I think we should just go ahead and keep talking about it.
I think I'm gonna lose connection if I try to open my browser.
No, don't worry about it. I think it's
but now I'm curious.
Yeah, it became a.
No, I actually wanted to discuss in those terms, but the fact is that they are not here, so I don't really. For instance, I would like to know what Miguel wants means when he says about syncategorematic. Was he thinking of exemplification as syncategorematic? I'm not sure I would agree with that, but there's a more technical issue regarding, Goodman's philosophy. Maybe it's not the place to go about here. The fact is you can't really have a dialogue. They are just, discussions among them and questions that we can't really ask for clarifications in order to answer them.
Can they be invited? Can they be invited here, or is it too much of a...
Yeah, maybe we can, yeah.
That would be nice.
If we have his email, we can just invite him and
yeah, okay, so I can send just the link.
We can send it in the chat box, maybe, yeah.
Okay.
Meanwhile, I think Cássia has a question, yeah.
Yeah, I actually have a question. It's a quick question to Mattin.
Yeah.
Regarding your score for sharing negativity. I think it's a great example for this notion of social dissonance, and it deals with a common trope in noise music generally, that is the use of and the thematization of negative affects. And I was wondering if this kind of negative affects or uh, angst, sadness, anxiety, how we can think about it in the context of social dissonance, and if there is a way to instrumentalize it and envision some way to overcome it.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and one that I'm very slowly kind of dealing with, because and and there was some critique to the social dissonance, in the sense like, okay, there's depends of who you feel anemically, you can feel more comfortable or not in this context of social dissonance, which in some ways it can be, or it was perceived maybe at the beginning, or it could be perceived as life trolling, but it's not, it's not really, I mean, it's not one person trying to laugh about another person or trying to make fun of. It's just like maybe exploring the kind of ridiculous character of our everyday life performance of selves, somehow. But obviously, this ridiculous character has very deep and fucked up consequences. And I don't think we have the proper mechanisms to socialize these consequences, because often, the mechanisms, it's either pathologized, these forms of alienation or disenfranchisement, they are pathologized or, individualized, as, it's your own, is your own thing that you need to fix, in order to function into society. And, but this only can further produce more social dissonance in the sense of generating the appearance of subjects that are healthy and others that are not. Well, I think there is a very kind of unhealthy, relationship, already present, that cannot be, ignored. So, and so I know that there is a danger in aestheticizing these kind of symptoms, but at the same time, they are there, and as I said, it's the kind of material that it's a kind of form of noise that is very everywhere, and that we need to deal with and try to find techniques, and maybe here I relate back to what JP was saying, find techniques, however humble they might be, to be able to socialize these effects of social dissonance or structural alienation that are here to stay for the time being, so yeah, so I'm trying to kind of, I don't know, play, being playful is not the right word, basically, but to kind of try to generate the techniques that allowed for these forms of negativity to be expressed and shared, hopefully in playful ways, that rather than furthering these negative consequences, they are we are able to share them and to socialize them and to understand how common they are and how they function, and see what we can do about them.
Thank you. Do we move now to the questions of people at YouTube?
We can do that. Maybe there was a question here from Greit, which I think is Eric Meyer. What are your thoughts on noise versus information with regards to political organization and the inside versus outside of that? maybe also inside rational discourse versus outside power dichotomy. I'm not sure who's that's directed for. I think it's for everyone.
I'd say Cecile is more equipped to deal with that.
Yeah, I agree, but if she doesn't
I'll pass on this one quite simply because I don't know if you guys have no. The reason why I'm not I'm passing on this is that I don't really understand politics at all. I find groups of more than 2 people already problematic. So this is 5 is okay, but you can't really make a revolution with 5 people. So just in that respect, the transposition of my thinking about noise onto the realm of politics is a giant leap for me.
I could try something out. I mean, I wouldn't put it in terms of noise versus information, because of course this is more of this way I was proposing that Cecile tries to answer, because it's more, I mean, the framework that Cecile is working with in epistemology of noise. But I could cash out this in terms of categories of world making. For instance, certain techniques that, for instance, Goodman puts forward, composition and decomposition, putting together and separating things, weighting, differences, which means differences in emphasis within the same set of elements, ordering, which has to do with the order of derivation of elements, deletion and supplementation, which means filling up or deleting information as suited to a certain aim, right? And deformation, reshapings that can be viewed either as corrections or distortions. Like, I'm not sure how those categories can, I think, offer a wide variety of ways of reading a situation, be it a static situation, political situation, social situation, whatever. But I'm not sure how they really relate to the distinction between information and noise, because it seems that then the judgment of noise is relative to the operation being put forward. Like if you're deleting, within the deletion, you are kind of normalizing a certain situation, then you are also dealing with a certain gradient of noise, if you understand noise in the sense that Cecile was discussing in her book with Shannon and Weaver, not so much in the sense of Wiener. In the sense of Wiener, it is actually quite simple to respond, it seems like. Every situation, in order to have a certain specific morphology, would have to exclude uncertainty and exclude noise, so organization against noise. So I think the question is already loaded with that kind of assumption, Wienerian assumption in a sense. Whereas if you cash out these operations that I was talking about in terms of Shannon and Weaver, it's much more difficult because you have to take into account the gradient of noise that goes into carrying over each of these operations. Okay, this is the first part of the answer. But it is also, of course, from the standpoint, from the theoretical, practical standpoint of, I don't know, the political thinker, but not of political organization. This is the difficulty. Because from the standpoint of political organization itself, you'll have to take into account the fact that the organization is unfolding in a sense that is not compatible necessarily with the individual understanding of what the organization is doing. So this is a crucial thing about politics, is that it's not transitive. What happens in its mereology is not transitive. Let us talk. I can use this kind of turn of phrase. Like, it's not, you can't really have the same relationship to the totality that the totality has to you. So you can't read off the totality as easily as the totality have, or regional totality, as the traction the totality have on yourself. So this is the kind of difficulty to come up with ways of tracing the movements of a certain localized social totality, which is simple enough because it has to do with theorization, coming up with proper frameworks to reading off situations. but which is more difficult to having causal efficacy from the standpoint of the interior to the, outer bounds of the situation. This is much more difficult, and it has to do with the critique that Mattin was making to life forming, which I agree completely. So it has to do with this. So then I'm not sure how to do it. I think it has to do with the fact that you'll have to come up with ways in which basically to have causal efficacy from the standpoint of a subset over the bigger set that compose the situation, in a sense. And of course, this is predicated upon a certain theoretical framework that makes it possible to read off the organization as being analogically as a kind of agent. The organization itself is doing things. So you have to be able to trace what these upper bounds are doing in the world, in a sense. So yeah, this quite long, convoluted answer, sorry, but I was doing my best.
I'll try to improvise here. It's a very complex question, but like some kind of thoughts started to become, to appear. I mean, for me, noise is, on the one hand, it's both the most abstract and the most concrete of, certainly of cultural expressions, in the sense that on the one hand, this abstraction allow us to try to have to deal at the cognitive level with, more and more abstract forms, and then on the more concrete level is because when you look at it in the most specific, in a very concrete kind of way, is you can try to analyze the kind of concrete disturbance in a send receiver information. So it has that kind of very rich, broad, and kind of the potential to look at it. And if we bring it into terms of politics, I think, in terms of noise, I'm, thinking here of Vladislav Surkov, which was the kind of advisor, is the kind of spin doctor to Putin. And he understands the power of noise in regards to using it for politics. He will, kind of finance both NGOs and fascists, as a way to generate, different forms of chaos and then the Russian population look for Putin as a savior, and it's like to try to confuse everybody, so that it's being used, noise is certainly being used in different ways to try to generate different forms of confusion and to, kind of destabilizes different grounds. I mean, the Tories in the UK, we've been seeing it in the last years for quite some time. The problem is, the left has not been able to cope with these uses of noises and I think it has to do with the way that it relies on certain stability or even transparency, or even, certain assumptions that I think they're problematic, like the possibility for social democracy measures in today's society. So it's like it kind of tries to rely to some kind of form of stability. It tries to, go back to either a past that it was better for us or to certain notions, but it's not able to jump into using noise as a strategy. Because precisely it relies into some kind of bringing back some kind of rational forms of stability or of life quality that are perhaps no longer possible or viable. So that certainly, for me, the question will be how to incorporate forms of noise that are able to take into account negative reminders that disturbs forms of stability, that they, the necessary kind of negative forms of disturbance that are constituted of our everyday life. And perhaps this is why it kind of got a conservative, it kind of has a kind of conservative stance, it seems to be the left, because it's like trying to hold to something that, to be honest, doesn't seem to be any longer possible. So I think, how to, political left kind of will, the political left will be able to work around noise. It seems like a job that is still need to be done. But maybe you already know of forms that they're dealing, how the left is dealing with noise. At the moment, I cannot think of any that comes now to mind.
Yeah, that's very good. I have one last question, but I think it's kind of stupid. It's kind of a naive question. But perhaps that's a good one to end on a more like casual note, which is about the sort of relation that the romantic thinkers and artists had to silence. And like, especially after Heidegger, how philosophy has, some philosophers have developed this glorification of silence, or some sort of mystic of silence, right? Like silence as this place beyond poetry or beyond prayer, right? Like it's, I can mention like Simone Weil, for example, or Flusser. Like there is like idle talk, and then there's conversation, and then there's poetry, and then there's prayer, and then there's silence, right? Silence is this realm, like a divine realm. Do you think that this begins as an anti-noise, like conceptual proposition? Like there is a mysticism of silence, but there's not a mysticism of noise. And I think we should avoid a mysticism of noise, right? As like JP clearly stated in relation to my own question. So what do you think is the ethical role of noise in our imagination of silence, right? What could be the parallels to this like scale of prayer, poetry, conversation, and idle talk, right? In noise. And is it possible and desirable to invent a romantic image of noise to against the sort of propaganda of silence?
Oh, I guess my answer would be almost the same as the one I gave previously. Like
Yeah. I figured that. Yeah.
almost the same, because silence in that sense is the same as noise, and this kind of shows how it is undetermined, like the use of noise there or of silence. It is a placeholder for the totality or for ataraxia, for a certain way, a certain. I'm of course my previously Wittgensteinian credentials show in this moment, because it reminds me of the end of the Tractatus. What one cannot speak thereof, one might have to stay silent, right? So it is this point of rupture of discursivity in a sense, like whereas I am critical of this gesture, as I was mentioning. I'm critical of seeing, noise as a plane of immanence, or seeing silence even as a plane of immanence. If we play within the Cagean rules, that noise is silence and silence is noise, actually. And the thing is, it seems like I am being contradictory here or paradoxical, but I'm not, because the fact is, as I was saying, they are placeholders here. They are placeholders of the lack of discursivity of a certain region of experience. So, I mean, it doesn't make a difference if whether it's silence or noise here. It's like it's the condition of ataraxia. It's a condition of discursivity ends here, something like that. I don't agree with it. I don't think there's a specific point where discursivity ends. I don't agree with it. Even if I'm an admirer of Wittgenstein's Tractatus, but I don't agree with almost all of its thesis. But yeah, I think it's a kind of reification as well. I think it's a kind of reification in order to have the superlative mystic thing. And the fact that they can be substituted one for the other shows that you are not really talking about silence or noise or any specific thing here. It's like really a placeholder with all these theories and these kind of philosophies that are kind of gambling with these notions. Like the structure of the argument is not bad. I think it might have something to it, but as placeholders, I don't think noise has anything as such to do with it, or silence. as such. I mean, as a phenomenological category. So it is basically a metaphorical kind of discourse, which has its application, but in terms of structuring a certain set of theoretical assumptions, I don't think it suffices.
Would it be possible to share the link to anybody who wants to join us? I tried to do it via YouTube, but it was not possible. Apparently, YouTube doesn't allow links. Is there any possibility that anybody can reach the link who wants to and just join us for the last minutes?
You could put it on Twitter, maybe. You can put it on Twitter. I don't know if
YouTube cuts it, but are you sending like a panelist link to everyone? Because then it would be just like a big mess, I think.
But I mean, if anybody has anything against it, or it seems like an appropriate way to end.
It sounds like a noise symposium, how it should be.
All right, you can do that if you want. I mean, we're almost over, so
well, just for everybody to say, maybe some, they can do, they can say maybe some things that they've been saying or something.
Share some negativity, right?
Exactly.
My negativity. I couldn't open my browser without crashing our call, but I'm curious now to know what people.
How are you sending it? How?
Oh, I think I can authorize here. YouTube like upholds it, but I cannot authorize it. I just that is this the link? Is this it starts with a dash? Is this right?
Who are you asking? You have the link, no?
Oh yeah, I have it, but I can. There's no like link for panelists. There's only link for auditing, which isn't like the auditors can't like say anything in the presentation.
Yeah, the auditor right. We can have like lots of written noise here in the chat bar, but not spoken noise or audible noise.
Okay, but that's still good to see people.
Can they be panelists?
If we have their email, we need their email to invite them as panelists.
Okay. So I mean,
I don't know if we have time for that, but we can try.
Yeah. So
I think maybe there's a way to promote auditors to panelists after their.
Yeah. Okay, I can do that. Yeah, good idea. Okay, I'll just send a link here then.
Okay, great.
Let's see what happens. Someone commented here.
Improvise Mattin's score with them.
Well, I think there is already plenty of things to talk. I mean, yeah, there is I think we have already, plenty of things to talk about, and they have, so they certainly have been discussing.
Oh man, it makes me so curious now. But if I open it, I lose you all, I think, because I have such poor signal where I am.
The panelist link here.
Rômulo, is the chat bar on YouTube still available after the live streaming?
I'm not sure. I don't think so. I thought it was
because there's quite an interesting discussion there. I'll just copy it. So I'll copy it.
Yeah. Do that. I think it sounds good. I thought it converted into like comments, but I guess it doesn't. I saw that from the last meeting. Yeah, we have some attendees
here. Cecile, in the chat bar here in the Zoom.
Okay, nice. Now I'm on my browser. I'm trying to find the link and
keep tuned. You don't need to do that. Just a sec. And then there's more. I don't think it copied everything. Just a sec. I'll have a copy to myself because I would like to address this in case people aren't able to come in.
Eric is here with us. If you want to say something, Eric.
Aren't able to come in.
What? Sorry. Eric is here with us. If you want to say something, Eric.
Universe.
I think it's my own voice coming back.
Best way to do expense reports? Not.
This is becoming okay. I think we just.
The rest of it.
Hello. Can one hear me?
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hi. Sorry, something with audio. It became really noisy. I don't know.
Hello.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Okay, that's cool. Hey, yes. So maybe one comment that I mean it's going a little bit more into the how you could think about noise in the terms of in the context of politics. Like my main question with the with regards to like an inside and outside of like organization, like and Mattin touched on this basically with the the left seems to have like a certain kind of almost conservative attitude and almost too moralistic attitude to say that something like noise and for example oversaturation with information could be used as a political weapon from our side as well, and that we shouldn't that we have to think about how we should do something like that and to break taboos about this. And in the same way, how do we not fall prey to our own weapons? Yeah, basically.
Is more a comment or a question?
It was, feel free to go to say whatever you want. Like it's more like,
hey. Of the question. Yeah, the question between the question about information noise outside inside a political situation.
Yeah, it's open for any follow-up whatsoever.
Yeah. I actually had something to say after what Mattin said about the politicization of noise. I don't know if politicization is a good word, but it seems to me that the left might have a problem with this because, and this kind of weaves into one of the first things that Cecile said, that there's no tabula rasa, right? Like you can't really start from a complete emptied out subject and something like that. So the problem is when you introduce noise, doesn't it further more of what already is? Like if there is a certain situation and the parameters are already, unbalanced, the social situation, and it's already structured. Of course, the purpose of introducing noise is to be able to change it. But the problem is, if you introduce just noise without any sort of control of this amount of noise and this gradient of noise, it seems to further what already is the case. And I was thinking of that. It is something that popped in my head, right? I'm not theorizing. It's not something I brought from before. Just because Mattin was saying, like, the use of noise in political propaganda, and this is something very familiar to us Brazilians, because Bolsonaro government basically used WhatsApp information and fake, so-called fake news and all of that, and this introduced a lot of noise. And why the fuck is it that this ends up actually reinforcing the worst reactionary impulses of the society? This is, I think, this. So, of course, the left has to have, regarding this, a kind of reactive attitude, because empirically what we are seeing is that if the noise is not mobilized within a certain parameter of control, it seems to reinforce what already is the case and the worst impulses, you see. So this might be an interesting question to explore. I don't know if it is.
But I think that's like, because I think, I'm thinking, okay, it's not bringing noise into it. It's acknowledging that there is already a noise kind of there is noise occurring, and there's no possibility to, but not only that, because then here, I don't know, I'm thinking of the relationship between religious belief and noise, because it's like, obviously the Pentecostal kind of churches were extremely important in the whole Bolsonaro, and there you have already a kind of something that cuts through the kind of there is a kind of belief system that is that goes beyond the means of the rational means. So there is noise, there is already certain forms of noise in belief systems that connect to the other possible forms of noise that a government can use in order to motivate and move kind of many millions of people. The question is that they probably don't think of them as noise. They don't. They are just submerged in what they think reality is, and but we could have a kind of perspective of noise in which we are able to identify and differentiate, between different forms of noise and be precise between the, utilizes and manipulations that one uses, and, other kind of acknowledging also structural forms of noise that already occur within the society that we are living in, and also being able, not being afraid of utilizing it, but for strategic purposes without kind of producing forms of mystification or myth making. That's, I guess, what I'm.
Yeah, I agree with that. This was what I was gesturing at when I said something like unconstrained noise might favor the situation as it is, like something like that. This was my point, to see. So that means that the left must still seize control of the amount of noise being put and the way it's being injected within the situation. You see, and for some quarters, you can mention here, for instance, unconditional acceleration is for some quarters. This is already a very reactionary position because we are not just letting go. But it seems in order to change things, we would have to have like a coordination and a kind of control of the amount and the way the noise is being injected within the situation. Because, for instance, in the Bolsonaro fake news propaganda thing, it's pretty unconstrained in the sense that it is basically the normal Joe is doing the propaganda for the government. Like it's the normal people. You see, of course, they have their agencies and the way it's not really an institution, but they have their ways of their organizations in order to put forward this information. But the fact is, there is already a social structure that is prepared to acquiesce into that, to accept that as true, and to spread it, in a sense. So there is a quite interesting use of unconstrained, let us say, dissemination there.
Yeah.
Whereas, which we could somewhat here loosely, I'm trying this out here, loosely relate to noise. So what would be a left version of it, really? Is it just to have the same kind of agency and just have, a certain different set of people to freely disseminate this news and this thing? I don't think so. This is a problem. Like the left have an organizational problem that the right doesn't have. You see, and this is why the left is reactive. There's a structural reason for the reactiveness of the left, which of course gets caught up into very bad gestures. Like I'm pretty much against cancel culture and all of that. But anyway, there's a certain tactical use for that. But when it gets, when it becomes the one means of political intervention, I think it's pretty bad, and it ends up like as a form of moralism. So it's reactionary, almost in the rightist sense now. But the fact that there is at least a certain structural reason for the fact that the left has to be reactive, comparing to the right, you see, in a sense.
Can I say something? I also think that the right can mobilize a conservative dynamics, the self-preservation in a situation of rapid change in which people feel, confused and fearful for their existential means. This conservative reflex is something that you can mobilize for the right quite easily, and therefore it is harder for the left both to propose something new, to propose more change on top of the change that's already happening but without guarantee, and at the same time to mobilize not the pessimism that the right can mobilize in people who want to come, to have a kind of catastrophic conservative reaction, but to mobilize an openness. I think that's probably much harder. And my reticence to answer the question about the politics is the fact that, yes, you can't really help, you can't have a political movement without coherence and organization. And you can see in recent movements like Cinque Stelle or in what happened with Macron, that the promise of a kind of improvised political movement that doesn't have the accountability of a party, for instance, that stands for something, means that, you know, when the winds change, the opportunities change, the politicians also who happen to be in a certain coordination, that you don't know what to expect for them. They have no accountability to the historical body of a party. One way, which I think is quite fundamental, that you can think about noise in political terms, but I don't know what its practical resonances would be. I really don't, but I still do think that is a fundamental political way of thinking about noise, is to come back to this transcendental noise that would be the level at the formation of the subject of what Mattin talks about when he talks about social noise. So on the one hand, you have social relations that are objectified and that become alienating. So what you have is, you have history as a process that posits a certain social body, and you have the social body that is posited, like the naturans naturata, for example. You have the cogito who thinks, and you have this ghost object, the self, the ego, the cogito that is thought. And the friction, the maladaptation between this process and the various iterations of the ghost objects that it poses, that are, you know, that have a transitory duration, a historical duration, sometimes, you know, phase of your life, that you identify with a certain idea of who you are. This friction, I think, if you mobilize it as noise, is like reappropriating the normativity of that moment of positing, as opposed to what is posited, and that what you then try to adequate yourself to, either individually or collectively. It's as if you could think of it in terms of what in biology they call neoteny, kind of undoing of the necessity of certain structures. And it's not a black or white, a tabula rasa. It's not that you get rid of all of the subject or of all of the coordinates of the self, but that you have a regional or marginal realm, margin. You have a margin of maneuverability where you can undo structures that appeared to be permanent. And that is very threatening, I think, for people who have a conservative impulse, because they are already trying to stem the flood of change that they're not entirely sure they can keep up with. But I do think it's something fundamental to think of in terms of politics. I just don't know what the practical applications could be. Or even if I made sense trying to say this like this in an improvised way.
But yeah, I just want to answer really quick, Eric, just because it's a clarification question. He's asking, JP, can you please say what is structural reason consists in? Just please specify it, and maybe also why the left has been in the reactive position because of this, and if this is a necessary position in this situation. Yeah, the point I was making, and Cecile just added a kind of interesting spin to it, is the fact that there's no tabula rasa, you see. I mean, if you just, let us say, if you just trust randomness, in a sense, to spread your propaganda. Let us take as example the Bolsonaro network of fake news, for instance. Most of it is a kind of delegated work. It's not really, they're not doing the work. They are doing an initial thing, and there's a bunch of people that are prepared to accept and spread this information. So there's a kind of a division of labor there. And this is because there's no tabula rasa. So if the societal conditions are already unbalanced towards the right, the injection of noise and of accelerating things in an unconstrained manner would necessarily favor the right position. This is what I was talking about. And this is why I see the left, because the left has to put in certain forms of control in order to route this to a desirable end game, right? It ends up being perceived, or it ends up actually being reactive to a certain way of the of the unfolding of the situation. This was just clarifying what I was talking about. But of course, Cecile and both Cecile and Mattin was talking about, Pentecostal churches and all that. This is, of course, this goes back in the order of reasons why Bolsonaro is successful. It is because also they weren't reactive in the first place. They were active, building up from the base, their social base, from their social approval, you see. So, yeah, I don't know.
I think Martin
saying that the left seems to have to be, in a certain sense, reactive up to a point, because it has to take control of a situation that is, if left unconstrained, seems to favor the way things are, not the way we want things to be.
But I think for me, the key question I'm thinking here, and using noise as a device, so I get back to the issue that it's not to introduce further noise. It's not, it's like, okay, we have existing structures that are based on the assumptions of several phantom objects that we've been talking about, meaning there is already, a lot of noise going on. So the question will be not to introduce more noise, as a kind of further, producing confusion, but rather to expose the kind of confusion that is already, in the structures that we have, and the way that, we try to keep things stable in whatever way we can, but they obviously are disintegrating, quite obvious to everybody. So the question will be, okay, what mechanisms do we have to expose the noise that is already there, and what ways, can we, in what ways can we deal structurally with these productions of phantoms objects that are generating such a, chaotic in the negative sense. So and here is what I will say, to use noise as a device, not to further kind of develop this kind of confusion, but like to expose into those assumptions that the left try to kind of stay and retain in order to show some stability in the confusion that we're living in, to expose that those are also, very, much, they contain a lot of noise within them, and they're problematic, and they're, it's like, and I think it will not be a tabula rasa, but it's like to engage with the level of noisy qualities that we have already in the structures that we're in, yeah, I maybe I'm repeating myself, sorry.
Maybe a very last comment. I think we're coming to what you just said, Mattin, and what JP also said. I completely agree with no, not uncontrollable, not like unconditionally injecting noise, but I think it's also very unrealistic that we are actually capable of doing that. And that's why such strategic questions of, under which conditions do we inject what kind of noise into what kind of an environment, and to focus on these more concrete questions as to have this kind of like minimum of controllability, and maybe not focusing too much on the overcautious stance, but to say, but that could be dangerous, but to actually focus on, how do we get that shit done? And then I think that's the more positive and more, I can't quite express that. But yeah, thanks for the conversation.
We are also like 1 hour and 50 minutes now. So if we could wrap this up and just... Yeah.
There is an idea here from Anna R. I just read, I don't know how many people are now on Zoom, but if we are many people, as a final collective performance, we could all activate our microphones at the same time and listen to it for 30 seconds or so. I thought it was a very good suggestion. If I don't know if anybody else will everybody be up for that?
Yeah.
You broke up. I didn't hear the last bit. To listen to what?
It's just to listen to everybody having the microphones on, and then just end up with that.
which should be
I
silent.
don't think we're that many in here. Huh?
Right?
We're just 7.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Let the feedback begin.
Okay, I mean, and we try to generate something or just listen. Anna, what do you think?
I thought your suggestion was to generate something and listen at the same time.
Yeah, I think the idea is to actually feedback the actual conversation into itself.
Yeah,
That could be interesting.
I don't know how to feedback here because my mic is not powerful enough.
no, but it's and then the thing, Zoom is very good at noise reduction, so it has very good algorithms. So you can go to the settings in the microphone, and then audio settings. There you have suppress background noise. So you can go low, medium, high, or so you can put it in low if you want. So, I guess we can already start playing around it. Let's do that.
Okay, and thank you everyone for your participation. And yeah, this was pretty good, pretty wild.
Yeah, thank you all.
Your participation and this was pretty wild.